Max and I got married in 2003 and had Caroline in 2004 and Natalie in 2005. Time with family was something he lived for. We were together for 16 years. We were best friends. Of course, he loved cars. That's what his business was. He was a pilot and he liked to fly airplanes. He loved boating and hunting, and he had a very strong faith in God. Max was unlike anyone I've ever met. He was one in a million. The girls and I, we left town overnight in February of 2020, and we weren't able to get a hold of Max, but that's not unusual for him. He would lose his phone in his truck on a regular basis, and we got home the next day. You come in and say, "I've been trying to reach you," but he had an aortic aneurysm, and so we found him, and that started, I don't even know how to describe the journey of grief. Everybody not only grieves differently, but even within a family, everyone's lost a different relationship. Where I lost my husband, my daughters lost their dad. We had great support from family and from friends and the church. It was amazing, but 3 weeks later, COVID started. The girls were 14 and 15 and they couldn't be with friends, and so that isolated us for a while. We still had, people bringing meals and leaving them for us, and so it wasn't, like we were so alone, but you're supposed to return to some sense of normal. Normal doesn't really seem attainable anymore. I just felt completely untethered. I felt upside down, totally lost. That was very, very hard without Max, when I had been doing everything together with Max for so long. So much of grief makes you feel like you're crazy. You just are in a brain fog. For me, it was like a physical weight I felt like I was carrying, and I was exhausted all the time. Better to address it and feel it and work through it than to maybe keep it down and then it doesn't really go away. There's a saying, if you don't deal with your grief will deal with you. It sounds like the last thing you'd want to do with your grief, but when the waves of grief overtake you, just allow it and lean into it and let it come out, let it pass. That's really the only way you start to make steps forward.
There's some sage wisdom in that, in those words from Janelle Holmes, an attendee not at this Grimes campus, but definitely a part of our Lutheran Church of Hope family. You saw, if you've been at our West Des Moines campus, you recognize the building. She's been walking around. They've been members there for quite a long time. And we're sharing her story today because she's been through quite a lot. And I know that many of us in this room have as well. And that's what we're talking about today. If you came looking for fun and excitement and laughs today to church, I don't know, I apologize. I did apologize at our 8 a.m. service. We're going to talk about loss, and we're going to talk about grief. We're going to talk about pain today, right? Who's excited to talk about pain? All right. I apologize to somebody in the atrium at our 8 a.m. service. In fact, I knew it was a member of our church family here at Hope Grimes had been through a lot. And I said, hey, just a heads up. And they're like, is this going to be like Christmas Eve where you made us cry like crazy watching the Chevy commercial? And I'm like, because Christmas Eve, somebody asked why we had Kleenex in all the aisles, and it's because I picked a video that just triggered our emotions. And anyway, we were talking about that this morning, and I was apologizing, and the person said to me, right, you don't need to apologize for that. It's real life. And so I'm not going to apologize for it. Instead, I'm going to give you a heads up that if you've lost someone, if your heart is hurting, or you know someone who's going through something right now, just a heads up, right? This might be a little heavy. I'm going to try and keep it light, of course, bounce back and forth, but it's powerful and it's important, and Janelle knows that. We are wrapping up this series today talking about Hope's Stories, which we've been talking about all month of April, coming out of Easter and Lent, and I got to tell you, it's been awesome. It's awesome to know and to see what God has been at work doing in this church for decades now. Hope will be 30 years old this fall, and it is incredible. Not the size of the buildings, not the number of meals that we've packaged for Meals from the Heartland or the food pantry. I mean, those things are all, the food pantry donation, all that stuff is incredible, but It's the people that call hope home that continue to blow me away. And so I want to ask you today, as we wrap up this series about our stories, where's your story headed? Right? Where is your story headed? And what is your relationship with your story? It's so easy just to get so busy these days, right? And just go on autopilot and just kind of make it through. And we're called to be in the moment and, be present. We're not thinking about the future necessarily. We're not thinking about the past. But in reality, I just would remind us, right, that it's easy just to get put on autopilot and to wake up someplace and to be like, how did I get here, right? And it's easy to go on autopilot and leave the pain of the past in the past, feel like we do that, and yet we're carrying things, right? Because the truth is today that we are a product of our past. I think that's true, but the good news is we don't have to be a prisoner to it. And so we encourage people to look back and to go through, and even the stuff you don't want to talk about, there's beauty and healing, and dare I even say joy to be had when we do. And so that's why we're bringing up these stories. It's not to make you feel bad that maybe your story doesn't have quite the ups and downs, or you don't have the courage, you feel like, I'm not ready to do that. It's okay. Some of us are just in the beginning. Some of us we've been walking with Jesus for a while, and we are aware, right? We've got a list of things gathered that God has done for us. It doesn't matter how long your list is, right? What matters is the God of the universe that's willing to walk with you through it. And what I just find absolutely fascinating about our stories, right? Different days, different genres. Some days just feel like a comedy, right? Some days definitely feel like a drama. Some days you got some romance, right? A little rom-com going on. Always exciting when that's the case. And other days, as Janelle will tell you, can be a tragedy. And that's what we're talking about today. And as we get into this, here's the obvious statement that I want us all to remember is that she's not the only one. Right? Of all things, I was working on this message this week, and on Friday at 3:03 p.m., actually, I screenshotted an email I got from the school. You see the subject line up here. It just says sad news. Right? Even my fifth grader is getting emails from the school about tough things. Right? This is the world that we live in. Her math teacher's husband was killed tragically in a car accident. If you're in the DCG school district, maybe you got this email as well. My daughter's math teacher, right, is going through a tough season. She's in the tragedy chapter, right? And the question is, where is that story headed, and what is it that happens? I don't need to go through all the examples, right? All of us can relate to the fact that there are days when we get sad news, and we don't love it. In fact, if we could do anything, right, I think most of us would love to be able to control the narrative of our lives, right? We would love to control the plot points and the cool things that happen. We would love to have the ability to write our own stories. And God gives us some of the freedom to be able to do that. But the reality is we live in a broken world that gives us broken stuff all the time. And as much as we want to be living the end, the happily ever after of the fairy tale novel or the action adventure movie, we find ourselves in the tragedy again and again and again. And so one of the things that I just think is worth acknowledging today is that, I just look at the people in this room. We have lost a lot. Congregation we have as a Hope family. I've been a part of Hope for over a decade, 15 years. And I was fascinated also by this picture in this hearse. And here's where my brain went. Maybe this is just a pastoral thing. But I'm like, is that a kid-sized coffin or is that an adult coffin? Right? And here's the reality of my job. I have had to do services for both. And this church family has had to have people, it has people in it today that have had to spend their hard-earned money on the very same thing. We have lost elderly people that we love, sages, people that we could look up to. We've lost moms and dads way too early. We've lost people that are in their 30s and their 20s, right? We've had to bury children. We've had to do services for babies that never even got out of the womb and were able to breathe oxygen, right? That's the world that we live in. That's part of life. And again, I'm tempted to want to apologize for it because who wants to come to church and talk about stuff like this? But the reality is it's real. And so as we dig into this today, here's one of the things I think we all need to remember is it was never supposed to be like this. Right? You look at Genesis chapter 3, the whole creation story, and God says it's good as he's making the earth, the seas, the stars, the sky. He makes Adam and Eve, and he stands back, and he looks at his whole masterpiece, and he says, man, this is very good. It's beautiful. And my favorite verse, honestly, in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and it's not because I have a middle school sense of humor, and everybody snickers when I say this, but the verse goes like this. Adam and Eve, they were naked, right? That's where the middle schooler in me does want to chuckle a little bit. They were naked, right? But here's the beauty of the verse, and they felt no shame, right? The world was so pristine and perfect and safe, right? They didn't have to worry about anything. There was no need for therapy or medical doctors or Band-Aids or any of that stuff. Because that's the way that the world was. There was no need to guard ourselves against, what's going to happen to us today? Even this morning, a member of the band got a call and had to run out of rehearsal this morning because something had happened and he needed to go see about his son. This is the world that we live in. We, as a congregation, have lost a lot. And it's not just people, right? We've lost dreams. We've lost jobs. We've lost opportunity. We've lost a sense of who we are at times. And when that happens, well, it gets really tough. You see, and we were tempted to read the first few chapters of Genesis, and we think, man, happily ever after, right? That was what God put on our hearts. That was the story that we were created to live. But in fact, what we end up with is heartbreak and loss, right? What we end up with is just a whole set of questions, right? I mean, just a whole bunch of opportunities to take a deep breath and look around. And what frustrates me the most, right, is we don't get to choose when those things happen to us. We don't get to choose whether or not, it is a given, right? There's no escaping being connected to death, our own death and the death of the people that we love. It is a part of our story. Man, some days I wish I had a different job and didn't have to stand up here and remind you of fun facts like that. But I think it's important because we look around the world that we live in, we look at the people, and even in this Christian community, Hope Grimes, Lutheran Church of Hope Grimes, the people that we know that are in Granger and in Johnston and in Grimes and Dallas Center that call this place home. They're battling this thing, and it's called grief. And so the question that I want to dig into today is, what do we do? And Janelle knows all about this, not because she wanted to, but it's where her life went. What are we going to do with grief? What are we going to do when life deals disappointment? We got a lot of options. So that's what we're talking about here today. And so as I was doing my research this week, I Googled it, because isn't that how you guys start every piece of information? You're trying to figure out, what am I going to say or what am I going to do in a situation? I just love to Google stuff. And I was thinking about the spectrum of grief. And by the way, this spectrum, this message is for all of us, right? I mean, I honestly got in jury selection. I got selected one time because I said, I'm a pretty sheltered kid. I mean, I've been to a lot of funerals as a pastor, but personally, my own family, really my grandparents. And that's it. And I know some of you, and I know that is not your experience, right? I was thinking about some of us, like the worst thing that's happened to us is a girl broke our heart, right? You know, we broke up with somebody, we lost jobs, and others of us have watched people that we love die in front of us. And so there's your trauma with a capital T. There's a whole spectrum here. And so I found a journal article in a medical journal of all things, and it was called The Spectrum of Grief. And I just thought, okay, this is saying some things I think we need to understand here today. And number one, loss is a common human experience. Turn the person next to you and say, duh. Turn the person next to you and say, duh, right? It is common. And grief is frequently seen in a physician's office. I won't make you say duh again, but I think you should probably after that, right? Grief occurs not only after death, and this is what I want us to get across today, right? But also during chronic or serious illness, infertility. Here's a sensitive one, divorce. Right? Maybe it was your family of origin that you grew up in. Maybe it's the family that you're trying to lead, right? Big changes. When two become one and that is torn apart, there's trauma in that too. And the reality is that grief follows trauma around. Job changes, surgery, rape, and so forth. Right? Now, some patients somatize. That's a word I throw around all the time. I don't know about you, somatize. Manifest, I had to look it up, to be honest with you. I kind of knew what it was. The Greek root, soma is body. I knew it was something like that. But somatized distress, presenting with physical symptoms. I think that's important for us to understand, too. You might be sitting here saying, oh, my gosh, we got to talk about negative feelings today. We got to talk about hard stuff. Like, doesn't affect me. Maybe you grew up in a household like mine, on a farm family, right? Scandinavian. We're not going to get anywhere near emotions. All the advice I got was rub some dirt on it, Andy. That's basically what I was handed as a coping mechanism. Not the best option. Why do we need to address this? Because it doesn't just affect your internal world, it affects your flesh and blood as well. Presenting with physical symptoms rather than acknowledging their grief. I can't relate to that at all. I'm sure you guys are 100% on just always walking into and facing and acknowledging and processing the deepest situations in your life. But just in case you're not, you need to know bereavement, right? Dealing with loss increases the risk of both psychiatric and physical disease and can exacerbate pre-existing illness. They're writing in medical journals to tell doctors, like, this is important enough, you got to keep an eye out for it. Don't just give them pills. Don't just put the Band-Aid on the broken arm. Get to the root of it. And the root of it is in our hearts. For the majority, it will resolve normally if we take the right steps, but in some, the process becomes morbid, right? Again, but it's this last sentence that made me think, okay, I've got to put this in the message this weekend. The family physician is in a unique position to identify, educate, assess, and intervene with the grieving patient and his family. I read that. You know what I thought? So is the church. So are we. And it took me all the way back to a conversation I've actually had last Friday and this past Friday where Pastor Murph and Pastor Jill, I said that earlier, and she's like, I'm not a pastor. I'm like, yes, you are. If you know Jill, our admin, would you just give God praise for Jill? It's on our staff. I was in a meeting with those two this week to talk about our future, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, man, Jill is amazing. And she almost slapped me after the last service because I was bragging on her, but it needs to be said. She keeps the two pastors here organized, which, woo, that's tall order. Right? She keeps all the rooms, the trains are running on time, right? We have schedules, we know where things are, like people usually, most of the time, have keys to get in the building when they need to, right? That's Jill. And as she's doing all these things, using her gifts, right, there's a bigger story that's going on here, and that's what we were talking about the last couple weeks as a leadership team of this church was to begin to say, God, where are you taking us in 10 years? What does Hope Grimes look like in 10 years? Because somebody somewhere along the way said, you should probably have a plan if you're going to lead something like this. I'm like, okay, right? I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, but let's think about 10 years. And it's fun, you guys. It's really incredible. Because I think about the moments like this, the moments that bring grief to us, and I think, yeah, what is our role in it? And it took me back to a moment that I had before I had this job. There was a year and a half or so that I lived in Grimes, but drove to our West Des Moines campus, running our men's ministry there and doing a bunch of other pastoral things. Eventually, they'd said, hey, like, would you be interested in taking this? And I'm like, I think so. Yeah, okay, cool. Let me pray about it. And I'm driving by one day, and I'm praying about this church. And I'm like, okay, like, that looks cool. Like, got a nice building. I wonder what the people are like inside. I'd been here a little bit, kind of knew some of that. But then God gave me these words, and this is what he said as I was driving. I just heard it. I just felt it. It popped into my head. A city on a hill. I'm like, what does that mean? Right? And I bring all this up in the context. I think one of the questions, at least that some of us are asking around here, is, God, what is your plan for this church? Why me? Why us? Why you? Why here? Why now? Why get out of bed on Sunday mornings to come to church, right, and drink the questionable coffee? I love our coffee. I think we could do a little, I'm a coffee snob, but, right, why fight? I mean, my kids never wanted to wear the clothes I wanted them to wear to church back when, we tried to tell them what they were going to wear. Why do all that? Why give up weekends? Why take the pay cut? Why do all this, right? Those are questions I'm asking. This is what God said to me, and I think he's saying it to us. You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp, then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. And in the next verse, this is a little different translation, but in the same way, let your light shine out for all to see. We just prayed it as a part of our baptism today, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. Okay, all that to say, why dig into grief? Why do we need to think not just about processing our own grief, but how on earth do you help people that are grieving around us? Because this is our call. I drove by this road, and the hill is very little over here, right? And I realize if we add on to this building, that hill will disappear. And we're trying to plan to add on to this building because we know we need more space, right? But it doesn't matter if there's a little hill there or not. We're called to be a city on a hill. We're called to be, church is not a business. It's not an organization. It's not a nonprofit. It is sort of those things. At the end of the day, this book talks about the church being a group of people that are family together. And so we're called to be a safe place for all kinds of people, but especially the hurting to come to find help and to find hope. And so all that to say, what do we need to know about grief? There are stages. It's not linear. It's different for everyone, right? That next bullet point really kills me. You can't control it. You don't get over it. You process it as you come. Notice that the last stage in the list of stages is acceptance. It's not eradication. In talking to people, I think of Bob Barrick in this congregation who runs our grief share class, not because he just thinks grief is cool, because he lost his wife a couple years ago, and he served as a pastor, is retired now, and of all things this morning he's playing banjo at another church, like incredible guy. But I was talking to him this weekend about this topic, and he started crying on the phone multiple times. He said, Andy, you got to watch out for the ambush. He said he was watching the Matt Damon movie, The Martian, of all things, and in that movie, his character hates disco music, and one of the songs came on, and he said he just lost it years after his wife had died. And we see people, right, and we're like, man, it's been 5 years. What are they doing? Why? What? Gosh, what's wrong with them? I don't think that's totally spot on. The research will tell you, again, it comes when it wants, as long as it wants. And so for us to let our light shine, it's not just when we're in this building, by the way, right? Most of the time, the church is most active Monday through, when you're not in this building, the entire week. You are the church wherever you go. And so if we're going to be attentive to these people, especially when the ambushes hit them in the middle of something at work, school, at home, in our marriages, what are we going to do? I think it starts with these questions. Again, I said, wow, what a fun day at church, right? Where are you wounded? You ever thought about that? And how are you caring for your wounds? Solomon says it like this. He knew a lot about wisdom, and one of the wisest things I think he said that at least I've globbed onto in my life is this idea that we have to guard our hearts above all else. Right? We need to be ready. It's not that the hits aren't going to come. Just ask Janelle. The hits will come. Ask a lot of people in this congregation. The hits will come. But are we ready? It's important because our hearts determine our next steps in life. And what I want us to understand is we've been designed for desert seasons. There's a passage in Jeremiah 17, and I won't read the whole thing to you here this morning, but it says, those who trust in humans, who rely on their own human strength, are like stunted shrubs in the desert, right? With no hope for the future. It said they're going to live in a barren land, uninhabited, salty land, right? The desert. But Jeremiah goes on to say, if we trust in the Lord, then we're like trees that are planted along a riverbank, right? When the heat comes, the roots dig down deep and they find what they need. When the drought comes, when they don't have what they need, the roots go down deep and they find what they need. We're built for this, but will we navigate it appropriately? Will we be able to make it? Because it turns out a lot can grow in the desert. We're going to close the service today singing about the goodness of God. And sometimes that idea, all my life you've been good, all my life you've been faithful, part of the words in that song. Some days I can sing that and it's easy. Other days, right, I did a funeral a number of years ago where I buried a 2-year-old and had to look at the mom who was right there, watched her son die in the car as they were trying to get him to the emergency room. She just looked at me and said, I don't know. And I agree. A lot can grow in the desert. Our despair can grow. Our anger at God can grow. Honestly, but so can our strength, and so can our roots, and so can our growth. And so all of that, it's a long introduction today, but it's really to set up this question. Here's what I want you to know as you leave here today. What is it that you need to know to be able to make it through the tough situations in life? Right? What do we need to know to help us get through our desert days? And maybe just as importantly, the world around us that needs God's love and help and hope. What do we need to know about that as well? And so the rest of the time here, I'm going to talk about our Bible reading for today. One of my favorite stories from John chapter 5, and I love it because there's a moment in this story where Jesus just looks like an absolute jerk. But I love that that's the nature of his love. It feels tough and pushy at times, but it's exactly what we need. Crowds of sick people, he says, blind, lame, paralyzed, lay on the porches. They're standing around a fountain. They're laying around a fountain because they need healing. And what's interesting about this particular location in Jerusalem is both the Jews and the pagans, the Gentiles, everybody agrees there's something about this water. And so it's not just to the people that are going to be eventually Jesus' disciples, not just the Jews that are getting the message. They're not seeing what's happening here, but it's everybody in the public square. This is about as central as it gets, and this is where Jesus chooses to show up one day. And you figure out there, they left us this little detail at the end. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. 38 years. Is anybody else in this room an impatient person? Is it just me this morning? Right? I struggle to wait when I'm the third person in line at Quick Star over there. Because I got to go. I got things to do, people to see, whatever, right? Like, don't get me started on the stoplights and all that stuff around here. I love the roundabouts. Roundabouts for everyone. 38 years, are you kidding me? And let me just ask you this. Just think out loud with me for a second. What is the condition of your soul? Where's your hope and your confidence at when for 38 years you've been longing for something and it's never shown up? I'm not going to spring out of bed on that one, right? It's tough experience. This guy is in a rough spot. To say he has calluses on his heart is an understatement. But Jesus shows up and something interesting happens. I just love the first three words of this. When Jesus saw. All right? You've been laying in the same place for 38 years. People just get used to you. Oh, yeah, there's Joe. Joe's over there. Yep, see you, Joe. Invisible to the people around him. He's just part of the furniture, right? He's got his place. He's always there. Jesus comes along. Jesus saw him. Doesn't move right by him, right? The text goes out of its way to say that Jesus saw this man. It didn't just see him with his eyes, right? But knew he had been ill for a long time. Now, maybe it was the smell. Maybe it was the indentation in the concrete where he'd been laying for 38 years. Maybe it was the look on his face. I'm just telling you today, you need to understand this, that one of the first things we need to remember if we're going to get through the desert is that God sees us in the midst of it, okay? And not just sort of sees you, but sees you enough. He doesn't just see what's at face value. He sees through you. He sees in you. He understands what you're going through. And this is powerful, right? Think just for a moment. How do you feel when someone finally understands you? When you connect with somebody? I was talking to Bob Barrick, again, a member of our congregation this week, and he told me this story that just killed me. It was just incredible. Because I think it gets to the fact that God sees us. He said the night that he had, that his wife died in their home, and the paramedics came and took the body out, and he had to, clean some of her stuff and remade the bed. I mean, just think about these details. It's fine. I mean, he's exhausted, right? And he finally crawls into bed, and he's sitting there, and as he's falling asleep, he just thinks to himself, he just says out loud, he told me, through his tears, he told me, God, Susan was his wife's name, God, would you just let me know that Susan is okay? Right? Pretty earnest prayer. And in that same moment, again, through his tears, Bob tells me, he just hears these words. You have my word. 4 words he hears. You have my word. And Bob said that he just lost it. And when he'd finished weeping, he rolled over, went to bed, and slept incredibly. Why? Because God sees him. Because he understands what it feels like when someone truly understands him. Because he's gotten that hug and that need and that provision from God. And so it continues, right? Psalm 34 talks about this. The Lord hears his people when they call to him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he rescues those whose spirits are crushed. I think he wants us to understand that we're not alone. We're not alone. But Jesus keeps talking to this man, and he asks this question. Right? He goes up to him, and think about this. He says, do you want to get well? Right? If you've been in the hospital bed, if you've been at Methodist for 38 years, and I come in and say, do you want to get well? I'm pretty sure you're going to punch me in the face, aren't you, if you're sick of being in a hospital bed and I ask that, right? What's Jesus doing here? Is he a jerk? No. I think he understands the danger of us getting stuck in grief. I think he understands, right? Because this guy's got calluses on his heart. He says, do you want to get well? And he says, I can't. Come on, Jesus, I can't. For I have no one to put me in the pool when the water bubbles up. He's telling his story. What he's really doing is saying, why, God? Why did you do this to me? Right? He's captivated. He's stuck. He's saying these things. When in reality, God wants to set us free through his presence. He wants us To get to the point where we can say, God, what? What do you want to teach me? God, what do you want to do in this situation? And we have to decide which question we're going to ask. I mean, I get why we ask why, God. That makes sense. But to stay in that for 38 years, it's not good. Because we have two choices. And the choices are, do we want to get better in our grief, or do we want to get bitter? And all this points to the fact that God cares enough to show up and meet us where we're at. He shows up enough to give this guy what he needs. He needs to be challenged first and foremost so that he can get from the why God to the what God. He's willing to pull out the scalpel and do some tough work around some very sensitive areas, not to hurt him. But he's realizing sometimes getting healthy and sometimes moving towards love, it can be painful. It can feel like pain. But this is why we have to ask the question, God, are you good? We have to be careful what we let grow in our desert. Because if we don't believe that God's good, we may not get there. God shows up for this man laying by this pool. He shows up for Janelle as well through a whole lot of different ways, including this church.
That had been mentioned to me around the time of the funeral was grief share, and I had never heard of it. I don't know that why you would ever be aware of grief share unless you needed it. Grief share is a 13-week, once a week meeting with other grievers of all different types of loss, and it was an amazing sense of not feeling so alone in my grief. That sense of knowing that other people were experiencing some of the same things just was a relief. And at the end of that first 13 weeks, I knew that I was in a very different place than when I had started at week 1, but I couldn't remember week 1 and 2 and 3, so I did the entire 13 weeks a second time, which is not unusual with grief share. I felt like it was a lifeline for me at that time to surround myself with that group of people. And Dan Cook and Colette Nelson were the leaders, both groups, and they were phenomenal. Community is key. And that was maybe because we were grieving in COVID, maybe I think grief share was my first chance to be in a community. When you isolate in grief, it's hard to move forward because you're just kind of stuck in the same place and you kind of don't seek ways to move forward and start to leave some of the feelings behind. People leave with a sense of hope. I think the biggest support that we knew we had was prayer. And more than any other time in my life, I felt that people were praying for me. I knew people were praying for me, and it was carrying me. I could just be honest about how I didn't feel strong on my own, that I just was relying sometimes every 5 minutes on God. Knowing that I didn't have to figure out a way to get through all of this by myself, that I didn't have to come up with my own thoughts and my own strength, and that God was already ahead of me in it and was just going to lead me. I have everything that I need.
She did, because she had God's presence and God's strength with her. You notice what she said was most helpful in the midst of all that? She said community is key in being able to understand it. And this is what they talk about in 2 Corinthians. Paul says, praise the God who brings all comfort, right? He comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort others as well. It's part of our call, part of our responsibility. God is our source of comfort, and we're called to share that comfort with other people. And one of our callings, right, to say it another way, is just not just to pretend to love people, but to really love them. And how do you do that? Right? I've shared a video from Brene Brown multiple times with different groups of people. And unfortunately, I've been preaching too long this morning, and I'm going to bypass it, but I tell you to take a look at it, because she's got some really incredible things in her work on shame and listening and play sharing. But what I love the most is the statement that she says at the end of her video. She says, rarely can a response make something better. Right? We love to say, well, at least you're not dealing with this. She says, rarely does an empathetic or helpful statement end or begin with the words, at least, right? Our job is not to fix people. Our job is to listen. It is to pray. It is to bring the comfort of God to people, Rarely can a response make something better. Our words, they just don't have that power. What makes something better is connection. And that's what Jesus is all about with this guy. Why does he ask him, do you want to get well, and risk ticking him off and depressing him even more? Because he knows if he's willing to tear down that wall, to poke him where it hurts the most, it will wake him up to be able to connect with God. And if we're going to be those kind of people, then we got to wrestle with this question as well. How comfortable are we willing to get with someone else's pain? How comfortable are we right now, right? How comfortable or uncomfortable are we willing to get as well? Now, I think this is where we're called to look at the image of Jesus. What did Jesus do for us? He was willing to get extremely, right? Excruciatingly uncomfortable to be with us. And I think we're called to do the same for the world around us. You're not called to die on a cross, to be born in a barn like he was. But I do think if you're in the atrium and you see someone that you know has some stuff going on, especially if they ever put the cryptic post on Facebook. I'm not sure how I feel about this, honestly. Need thoughts and prayers post. I agree Facebook is not the place to go into detail, but if you are Facebook friends with somebody that posts that, pick up the phone. If you see them in the atrium, if you see them at the grocery store, let's be the people that talk about the hard stuff and get to the root and find God's healing in the midst of it. I think that's what we're called to do. I think that's who we're called to be as a church. And all of this is possible. And the third thing we need to remember in the desert, and that's the fact that God wins. Listen, here's the thing, right? There are a lot of bleak things, a lot of unexpected things that happen in our world and happen to us and the people that we love. But let's take comfort in the fact that we know the author of life, that we know the one who has all authority in heaven and on earth, right? We know the God of the universe that's able to look at this man and say in verse 8, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. And it says that he was instantly healed. Everybody goes crazy, right? Because they've just seen heaven show up on earth. And we know that that's going to happen again. In fact, we know how the story ends. We know Revelation 21 tells us, right, there's going to be a day where Kleenex is going to go out of business, right? The news is going to be ridiculously boring because we don't need it, because there's no blood. The phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, is going to be irrelevant to the world that we get to live in. No more surprises. Back to the Garden of Eden where everything is taken care of. That is where our hope comes from, you guys. That is where the strength to get through the emails you get from the school and the stuff you see on the news and the phone calls and the text messages that you get out of the blue, that is what helps us with those moments. And that's what's gotten Janelle through the last couple years for her as well. As you watch this, notice the posture of her soul she describes. It's not a posture of fear. It can be a posture of frustration at times because grief is unpredictable. But it's also a posture of confidence and a posture of surrender. As you watch this, think about your posture today.
There's so many points of indecision, especially as a widow. I have to make these decisions by myself, and I don't feel alone in them. I know that God is in the decision with me. I think sometimes what's been frightening is when God is leading me, but I'm thinking, really, God? I don't know if that's what I had in mind, but I will trust you. I know you will provide. And each day, one day at a time, I've come to the point of more than 4 years since I started just surrendering every morning. This day is yours, and just give me the strength. It's just been such a relief. God has really replaced my need to know and my need to plan with a sense of peace. Lord, you are my shepherd. You are my shepherd. I have so much trust that whatever happens, it'll be okay because God's got it. That isn't to say that everything's good all the time, because a lot of it isn't. And a lot of times have been extremely challenging. And there's been a lot of fear. I just always know that God's in control. One of the nights of grief share is a night we call Heaven Night, and Pastor Murph Hudson from Hope Grimes joins us. It's fascinating to hear people ask their questions. My questions were things like, does Max still love me? That was so important to me. And Murph had this amazing response that he loves me more now than ever because he's in the presence of God. And in the presence of God, there is only love. And that was just amazing to understand that. This is not forever. We will have an eternity together. We will be back reunited in heaven. Starting to shift to that mindset when I was able to has helped a lot. So we just talk about him a lot and laugh and tell stories. I think we're doing really well. We're at a place I don't believe I could have seen in the early months. It's still hard a lot of days, but we miss him. We miss him a ton. His absence is huge. It's not like it gets better and stays better. That's kind of the roller coaster of grief. You're just sort of on the ride, I guess. You just have to navigate it one day at a time. I would wake up every morning and pray to God that he would give me the strength I need to get through that day. And every night I would thank God for giving me the strength to get through that day. And that was how I managed in those early days. And it's how I manage today. I still say that prayer every morning. I have scripture that I recite every morning that reminds me where my strength comes from. I just have been aware that I have surrendered it all.
So we know the ups and downs will come, but how do you navigate it? What did she say? Day by day, step by step. And again, at the center of all of it is surrender. That's our option. That's the best course of action, is to let the God of the universe lead us through whatever difficult, whether we're at the beginning of the spectrum and it's something simple, or it is as tragic gets. Your heart matters. The way you take care of it, the way you let God into it, the way you let him love you matters. And at the heart of that is this belief. Do you believe that God is good? We're going to close the service today. We're going to sing that song, The Goodness of God. In fact, I want to invite you to stand right now because we're going to sing that song. And as you do, you have a choice. Do I believe that God is good or not? And as you do, I hope that he's been faithful. I hope you can sing that out. Let's sing together.